Hi there. My name is Jim Barrett. I'm an economist and I have my own consulting firm called Barrett Economics. Uh, like most economists, I tend to think that the economy has a lot to do with just about everything. And when we talk about things like sustainability, energy, the environment, a lot of that has something to do with the things that we buy, the things that we make, and how we make them. And most of that happens in a market context. And since economics is largely the study of how markets work, we tend to think that economics has a lot to say about all of those issues. So my background obviously is in economics. I got my master's, Ph.D, and my bachelor's degree all in economics, which is one way to become an economist. There are other ways, but one way or the other, they all involve putting some serious time in at school and learning as best you can how markets behave and how, importantly, how people behave in a market context. So I did my time in school. I wrote my dissertation and left and joined a think tank that focused on actually mostly on labor issues. But they were also very interested in figuring out how we can make the transition from where we are today or where we were then, which was quite some time ago, to where we would like to go, which is a cleaner economy, a more efficient economy, an economy that pollutes less, produces more, and shares it more broadly. Since then, I've worked for a number of different institutions, research groups, think tanks, advocacy organizations, as well as a little bit of time on Capitol Hill. But pretty much everywhere I've been, that has been the focus of my work, my career, is how do we get from where we are today to where we would like to be, and how do we make markets help solve some of the environmental sustainability problems that they've helped to cause. One of the primary ways that economics plays a role in dealing with environmental and sustainability related issues is in the realm of policy design. And this really, for me, is a matter of solving a puzzle. We look at what we do, how we do it, what we want to do differently, how we want to do it differently. And since we can't really tell people what to do as much as we might like to, it's really up to us to design a system that provides them the right incentives to do maybe not entirely what we want them to do, but maybe do what they want to do in a slightly cleaner way. Now, a good chunk of my work that involves policy has been around climate change, and it doesn't have to be the only thing. Maybe it's not the most important thing, but it's the thing that seems most relevant to me, or at least did when I was working on it full time and maybe more than full time. And for economists, we approach this from a very simplistic standpoint in many ways. Climate change causes costs. It creates costs that society has to bear, both nearby and worldwide. And these are costs that people who are buying and selling goods that pollute, those are costs that these people don't have to pay for. So we look at this and we say, this is a simple problem of math and markets, and all we have to do is adjust the prices so that the people who cause the pollution and create the costs are the same ones that bear it, or at least pay the full cost of their behavior. And this leads us down the road of things like carbon taxes or cap and trade systems, and any way that we can get people to see the cost of what they're doing and make them responsible for it is one way, anyway, to solve problems of environmental economics, whether it's climate change or other types of pollution. Now, like I said, this is not the only way to solve problems, and these are not the only problems that we might want to solve. However, I will say that working in policy, some of the most rewarding, in some ways the most amazing things that I've ever worked on, two in particular, were actually both very similar. In California and in the northeastern states, they have carbon trading markets, where if you want to pollute a ton of carbon, if you're a producer and your product pollutes, you have to have a piece of paper that says, I have the right to pollute 1 ton. And to get that piece of paper, you need to pay for it. And you pass those costs on to consumers, and that's how we, as we say, internalize the cost of pollution. And they have one similarly in, there's one in California and one in the northeastern states. And years ago, an organization that I was leading, we were one of the experts on how to design these types of carbon markets. And I'm very fortunate to have the chance to work with a team of really, really smart people. And we helped to write the first draft, the foundational ideas of both of these markets, both the regional greenhouse gas initiative in the Northeast and in California, California's Global Warming Solutions Act. And it's a pretty incredible feeling, at least for me, for a social scientist. I don't do experiments. I can't work in a lab. But we sat down and we talked and we thought and we wrote and we helped change the world. And as hokey as that sounds, it's a great feeling, and it's a pretty powerful thing. These days, I tend to work on different issues and in different ways. I think as far as climate change goes, I think we have a pretty good idea of what kind of policies we need to solve the problem. And really what we're lacking is political will, at least from, again, the social science standpoint. Now I've branched out a little bit more, and I tend to work a lot on things like clean energy finance, which is, how do we design, how do we design markets so that people and countries can afford cleaner energy? In the long run, cleaner energy is actually less expensive. But if you think about putting up solar panels or a wind farm or something like that, they typically require a really large investment up front and lower costs sort of down the road. But those upfront costs can be significant, can be really large. And particularly if you think about your own house or wherever you're living, if you wanted to put solar panels on the roof there, it would cost tens of thousands of dollars, and most people don't have that kind of money lying around. And so finding ways to create systems so that people of all income levels can access the clean energy future to help reduce pollution, reduce their own energy costs, and make that transition to a cleaner economy. That's a lot of what I've been working on as well. Now, if you are a social scientist like me, maybe it's specific to economists, I don't know. One of the most important things that I learned from leaving school to where I am now, a couple of decades later, is that people don't behave necessarily the way we think they do or how we want them to. Reality is much messier than we like to think it is. And so a lot of times I make the analogy that that we teach economics in the classroom is like teaching physics without friction. But it's even worse than that, because at least friction is predictable. In many ways, people are not. And so we create our models and we create our tools and create our policies. And then every now and then we come up with these, we see these unintended consequences where people look at the structure, look at the policy infrastructure around them, and make decisions that are not the ones that we were hoping to make. So, fortunately, I'm happy to say I'm not responsible for any egregious mistakes with terrible unintended consequences, but they are out there, they're everywhere. And for, in my world, absent a laboratory where I can rerun an experiment if I do something wrong, perhaps, these are the things that are for me, the things that we have to watch out for the most. And so, for example, I'm working now on a project that involves electric vehicles and how do we make the transition, I'll say it again, from where we are now to where we want to be. And as part of this project, I've had the opportunity to talk to people who work in car factories, who work for the big three, who are members of the auto workers union, and talking to them about what it is that they do now and what we think they're going to do in the future in making electric cars is worlds different than what we might think if we just sat down and thought about even a very detailed sort of production model of a car, getting down into the, from the 30,000 or 40,000 foot level down to the factory floor. You really learn a lot about how the economy really works and how people behave in these market contexts. So among the pieces of advice that I would give people, so one of the pieces of advice I would give people who are thinking about getting into economics is, yes, you learn your models, learn everything that everybody wants to teach you, but also make sure that when you sit down to do your work, that you have some connection with or some idea of what is actually happening on the ground as you try to think about how to make things better or different. Right now, I'm working on a project with the World Bank about how do we help countries in the Middle East and North Africa transition from their current energy systems to clean energy systems. And of course, we sketch out what we think the project looks like, what kind of policies, technologies, and all these other issues that we might want them to implement. But at some point, we had the opportunity to sit down and actually talk to officials from the Moroccan government, Moroccan industry, consumer groups, and fortunately, we didn't have to throw out everything we did, but we had to sit down and take a serious look at how we thought the world worked and throw out a good chunk of it and start all over again. And so I think that, once again, is incredibly important for anyone who's coming into this, is to remember that you really don't know, unless you've talked to people, unless you've seen it, you really don't know the situations that people face. So for people who are looking to become economists and work on environmental, climate change and sustainability issues, your training will push you strongly toward, in my experience anyway, our field is becoming extremely technical, much more technical than it used to be. Computing power is, of course, so much greater than it was even 20 years ago when I was getting into the field. And so the field has sort of followed that trend. And I think it's really important to learn those tools. And once you've learned those tools and learned them well, then it's time to start thinking about, what do they miss? What parts of the human condition, of the market economy, of people's behavior, do they not model well? Do they not understand? Where are these unintended consequences that we're likely to see? But first, before you start that critique of these models, these theories and tools, learn them well. Nobody's in a better position to critique the orthodoxy of economics than people who have learned it and know it like the back of their hands. The other thing I would suggest is, and maybe this is just my own personal bias, but since I left school, it was really, really just starting back then, the Stone Age. To take a step back, one of the things that's difficult about economics and social science in general is that we really don't have good ways to run experiments. Maybe in psychology, you put the rats in a maze and you can do those types of experiments, but we really have no way to experiment easily with economic policy. And as I said, about 25 years ago, I started anyway to hear about this new branch of economics called behavioral economics, which actually discovered ways to do, not rat and maze type of experiments, but to do experiments with people and to see how they react to different things, how they value different things, and how they're likely to behave under different circumstances. And a lot of times, if you look at what these experiments are telling us, it runs directly counter to some of the assumptions that we use to build our fancy economic models that tell us how the economy is going to work. And here we have reality throwing sand in the gears of our machines. And it's really important, as much as we might like to not ignore that. And I would also say, again, I think this might be specific to economics, which is not to leave your humanity behind. We study markets, we look at how things work, we think that if you do A, that B will result. And sometimes we forget that there are people in these markets, that these consumers, these people who are buying and making things, are all human beings. And it's easy to say, for example, in the context of climate change, well, we need to move away from fossil fuel energy towards clean energy. It's not just easy to say. I happen to think it's the truth. But if we make that transition, we can't ignore the fact that people and communities, although the rest of the world is a better place for us having cleaner energy and lower carbon emissions, for example, there are people in communities who we will be making worse off. In Appalachia here in the West, the mountain states, in oil states. And it's, as I said, it's easy enough to say, well, we need to make this shift. But in saying that, we're also saying that these people, these communities, some people who've known nothing but being coal miners, we need them to stop mining coal. And that's the way they know to feed their families. And to simply say that they need to stop, I think really is the height of hubris. And that if we don't design a fair approach to making this transition, we do it at our own peril, because the politics of this transition will get in the way. So back when I used to teach, we talk about, the nature of markets and how they work. And I always liken markets to wild animals. If you go on safari in Africa, or if you're watching a nature show and you see a lion chase down the weakest in a herd of zebra, and that becomes their meal, we say to ourselves, well, that's a shame, but that lion or that tiger, it's the way it works. It's the way life works, and we don't interfere, because that's nature. Now, if there was a lion or a tiger running around your city, culling the weakest people from the crowd walking down the street, of course we would intervene and stop it. Right? That's not nature, or maybe it is nature, but it's an outcome that we don't believe we should sit with. So when we look at markets and we see, just because they drive a particular outcome doesn't mean that's the outcome that we have to accept, and that what the market decides is not always what's best for humanity. And so I urge people, always coming into economics, it's easy to forget the humanity in what we do. And it's really important that we don't. Thanks.